So by now you've learned that one of the important components of making an argument is addressing counter-arguments as well. But why? Why would you want to include people who disagree with you? Why would you want to include that in your argument? For a few reasons. So if you include opposing viewpoints, you can show your readers that you considered all sides. Obviously, your recommendation is going to be stronger if it considered all of the options and chose one versus ignored some of the options. Another reason to include the opposing viewpoint is to anticipate your opponents. We've all done this in situations perhaps when we were younger and we were asking our parents for things, and we'd say, can I go stay at so-and-so's house? I've already done my homework and her parents will be home the whole time, because we know our parents' objections and we want to jump on them. Or, can I have dessert? I ate all my green beans. So the same way, we want to show our opponents that we understand where they're coming from. You can also use an opposing viewpoint as a springboard to introduce your own reasoning. For example, perhaps your argument is that partially hydrogenated oils should be illegal. And one of the opposing viewpoints says that this would prevent poor people from having access to food because this is a cheap source of food. But you found a source that says another oil is actually more cheap to produce, that's healthier. So you could use the opposing viewpoint to introduce your own information in that case. Now, once you have your opposing viewpoint, you have several different options for refuting it. Here are some of those ways. You can cast doubt on how typical or sufficient the examples are. Maybe they don't have enough evidence to come to their conclusion, or maybe their evidence is not representative of most situations. You can deny the accuracy of the data. Perhaps something that they're saying is not true, and you can explain why you believe that to be the case. You can also do these things when they use quotations. You can question whether that quotation is accurate or whether it's being used out of context. For example, if someone said that sugary drinks have the potential to harm health, that might be very convincing until you find out that the next sentence that person said was, because anything that's used in excess will harm health. So you want to see if the person is faithfully using their quotations. You can also look at how relevant or perhaps recent some evidence is. So you can say, is this actually addressing the argument at hand? Is this what's being debated? One example that we used to look at in my course was an argument on whether mosh pits should be legal, and one of the support for being legal was a person saying that she really enjoyed being in mosh pits. But the debate was not whether they were enjoyable, it was whether they were safe. So the fact that she thought it was fun didn't really have anything to do with the argument itself. You can also look at how recent a study is. Some things don't get old, but some things become obsolete pretty quickly. So you want to consider whether maybe old information is still current or not. You can also cite counterexamples and counter-testimony to combat examples and testimony given by your opponent. If they have an expert who says one thing, you find two experts who say the opposite, or a better qualified expert who says the opposite. If they give you an example, you can give an example that contradicts what they say. So you can kind of turn around what they're saying. You can also question the credibility of authorities that your sources cite, or of their own, or of the source themselves, the author you're arguing against. Maybe they're not qualified to speak on the subject. Or maybe there's a conflict of interest that should make us doubt whether they're being entirely honest. You can question studies. How are statistics produced or interpreted? Maybe the way the data is gathered, there's a problem. Perhaps a study doesn't cover enough people or have enough samples in it. The sample size is small, or maybe sample selection was skewed in some way so that it's not an entirely honest study. Maybe the researchers aren't particularly respectable. Maybe there's another explanation that could be given other than the one provided. You can also look at how statistics are used. You've probably heard of the book, How to Lie with Statistics. You can switch between whole numbers and percentages depending on which one sounds better to you. As an example, if 10,000 people are injured in mosh pits over the past decade, that number 10,000 sounds pretty big. But if we started looking at the percent of people, or even if we started breaking it down per year, that starts becoming a lot smaller. So that's going to probably be less than 1% of people who even went to concerts. And we say less than 1% of people who went to concerts got injured in mosh pits, suddenly it doesn't sound like a big deal, whereas 10,000 people, that does sound like a big deal. And so you can choose whether using the whole number or percentage is more convincing to you, and you can look at whether the person you're arguing against is using a whole number or percentage, and point that out as a way of refuting their argument. Now, sometimes there's nothing you can do but agree with your opponent. Sometimes they really do have a point. They're correct. They have pointed out something that is a problem, is a flaw in your plan. Often when that happens, the point is not that you disagree with them so much as you disagree with them on what is the most important. So they've noticed a problem with your plan, but you are going by a different value. So, for example, someone might argue that racial profiling should be used to stop terrorists. But you think that it's more important to maintain our civil freedoms and respect people's individual rights than it is to possibly make it that fragment easier to stop terrorists. So you can argue on the basis of values. Yes, you're right about something, but. Not that that argument's necessarily right, but that's a way you can combat it. Now, when do you acknowledge opposition in your thesis? This doesn't happen very much, but sometimes your entire argument is a counter-argument. So you are arguing perhaps that a law ought to be repealed or that a very commonly held position ought to be overturned. If basically everything in your argument is in opposition to a task, if it's a negative argument as opposed to a positive argument, so if it's a we should not instead of a we should, then you might have to include it in your thesis. But do be careful if you are including an opposing argument in your thesis that you don't give it too much strength, too much weight. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have a practice argument and look at some possible opponents that we're going to determine, first of all, how we're going to refute that opponent, and second of all, where in our essay we might put that refutation. So, first we're going to look at our basic argument here. The sample argument we're going to be using is that the Federal Communications Commission should not be allowed to censor television networks. Our reasons for that are going to be that such censorship violates Americans' right to free speech, that their policies don't differentiate between material that has artistic value and just plainly gratuitous material, and that censoring some media is pointless if we can't censor all media. For example, it's silly to be censoring TV programs when the internet's out there with all kinds of stuff on it. You'll notice as we progress through these potential opponents that they get stronger as we continue. Actually, most of these first opponents wouldn't even be chosen to use in our paper because they're too weak and they would create a straw man argument. You don't want to choose an opponent that's really weak. You want to choose one that's respectable so you can, say, make an honest win. Just like if you were, say, going on if you're playing a game with, say, a 2-year-old and you beat the 2-year-old at the card game, then do you really feel good about your skills at that game? Right? Probably not. So you want to have a worthy opponent. Here's our first potential opponent. We've read an article in Parent Magazine where a mother of 3 young children is quoted as saying, "Just as your right to swing your fist ends at the end of my nose, your right to free speech ends when it reaches my ears and eyes." There's a few things we could do with this. We could say this quotation was taken out of context. Maybe she was talking about something other than television broadcasts. We could also question her authority. Being a parent doesn't really qualify you to discuss constitutional law, so perhaps she's not the best expert. If we were using this, we would probably put it in our first body paragraph here where we talk about free speech. But again, that's not the strongest opponent. Our second opponent is a newspaper article that reports on a young child who seriously injured a classmate trying to act out a scene from a popular television show. If we were trying to address this, we might say that it's not sufficient because it only discusses one incident. So just because it happened once doesn't mean that's enough to say that TV is dangerous. We might also argue that it's not typical. How many of you ever played pretend on the playground? You probably didn't seriously injure anyone doing it. So it's probably not typical for such pretend games to end up in injury. Another thing you could do is concede that yes, children do get ideas from television, but you might shift to a new field of values. So perhaps while these children might end up acting out when exposed to violent media, fighting censorship could protect everyone's rights. Where would we put this? It's possible we could put this in the rights to free speech. It's possible we could put this on censoring some media, since we could say that if children are still exposed to, say, violent video games, then there's not really much use in making sure that they don't see violent television. We could give it its own paragraph, too. Perhaps after these 3 paragraphs, provide our own paragraph. Again, that's not the strongest opponent. So let's try opponent number 3. Opponent number 3 is the American Family Association. They've issued a report condemning a popular television series that alleges that each 21-minute segment, excluding commercials, contained an average of 23 sexual innuendos. So we're looking at this study. We can consider how was this study performed? How did they figure an average? Did they look at 1 episode? Did they look at 3 episodes? Did they look at every single episode that aired before they determined what the average was? What did they count as a sexual innuendo? Do you agree that that's actually... Do you agree with their interpretation? Another thing you could do is offer a counterexample. Personally, I would bring up Shakespeare. Shakespeare tells some dirty, dirty jokes, but he is considered literary art. So maybe this is art in its own way. And of course, if we were going to discuss that and use that particular refutation, I think that our second paragraph, where we're talking about the difference between art and gratuitous material, might be a good place for that. But again, that's not the strongest study. Here we go. Now we have a peer-reviewed journal article. So now we're getting into a place where we have some respectable sources that we might really want to consider a formidable opponent. This peer-reviewed journal article found that teenagers who visited a clinic for unplanned pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases were 7 times more likely to have been exposed to explicit media before the age of 10 than those in a random control sample. Of course, whenever you have a study, you might want to consider the methodology. How did they choose their subjects? Is there a bias in the way subjects were chosen? Is it perhaps more likely that teenagers are more likely to self-report on having been guilty of one thing if they're guilty of something that's worse? For example, if they're already in trouble for having an STD or unplanned pregnancy, maybe it's okay for them to admit to having watched explicit media, whereas a teenager who's not in trouble for anything is more likely to lie about having watched explicit media. That's speculation, but it's enough to draw into question, right, the study. Consider if there's another factor that causes both of these situations. Maybe people who do not have active parents are both more likely to do both of these things. It's not that one causes the other thing. You can also look at the statistics themselves. Maybe they're not as significant as they sound. Perhaps it is 7 times as many because only 1% of regular teens watched these films, while only 7% of troubled teens did. That's not a giant number. Maybe it's 0.01 and 0.07. I don't know. So you might want to look specifically at those statistics to see if you can argue against them. Where would we put opponent number 4? We could probably put in any of these things, but I think I would probably give that my own paragraph, just because it doesn't clearly tie to one of these other subjects here. All right, here's our last potential opponent. This is a literature review. That means that someone is reporting on what a lot of other studies found. It's published in a prominent sociological journal, and it cites more than 20 studies that show visual effects of visual media on brain activity, brain chemistry, behavior, and attitudes of both adults and children. Wow. How do we argue with that? Again, it is a study, so you can go look at the methodology. Were they biased towards studies that showed a positive effect? So the studies that found did they leave out studies that found no correlation? We can look at what exactly kinds of effects are they. So it just says effects. Maybe they're positive effects, maybe they're neutral effects. Are they necessarily negative? Let's say this is a very strong opponent and we don't feel that we can argue against them. We feel like, yes, they are right. It has been proven completely that visual media do in fact influence people. How do we deal with that? Well, we can concede and move to a new system of values. So we can say, yes, media undeniably does influence people. However, individuals should be the ones making the choice for themselves whether they want to be exposed to that influence or whether they want their children exposed to that influence, not the FCC. So we could concede and shift to a field of new values. And of course, if you have a pretty strong opponent, you're going to be more likely to put it in its own paragraph. I also feel like this could go in our paragraph that is on different kinds of media, because we also want to consider what kinds of media they're looking at. Maybe they're not even looking at TV. So that's another way you could possibly get in there. And a lot of these ways of refuting your opposing viewpoints do depend on details that these examples are not detailed enough to show you, but you might have to look at in your individuals. Last, I want to make sure that we remember that our opposing viewpoints might be directly opposed to our main argument, they might be opposed to our supporting claim, and they might be opposed to our assumption. So for example, if our main claim for our essay is that we should adopt a national ID card system for the protection and convenience of American citizens, then someone who directly opposes us would be arguing we should not adopt a national ID card system. And we may find that. Now, our assumption when we make this argument is that people want protection and convenience for American citizens, and you're not likely to find someone who disagrees with that, so I didn't even consider that as a potential opposing viewpoint. Let's say one of my reasons to support this thesis, one of my supporting claims, is that adopting this national ID card system would deter illegal immigrants, making it more difficult for them to access government services. Now, someone who disagrees with that might have the argument that national ID cards would not make it more difficult for illegal immigrants to access government services. So there's another potential opposing viewpoint I could have. Notice my assumption here, my reason, that we want to do this to make it more difficult for illegal immigrants. Someone might disagree with that. Someone might say, no, we don't want to deter illegal immigrants. That's not a desirable outcome. Because maybe they are people who are even more in need and they need more help than, people who have citizenship. Not everybody is going to be for or against that. But that is a possible place where someone could disagree with us. So now, if we were making this argument, we would have these three potential opponents. That doesn't mean we need to address all of them. We need to pick and choose what the strongest opposition is and what's going to fit best with our individual argument. But hopefully now you have a lot better idea of what you can be doing to address opposing viewpoints in your argument, how to effectively refute them, and how to find those opposing viewpoints sometimes when it might seem like your main argument isn't something that people disagree with, but someone might disagree with one of your supporting points or even with your proposal part of your argument.